Chuck Berry is the father of rock and roll.
He laid the foundations for an entire music genre.
Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music, any old way you choose it.
He found that fire within him and he managed to harness it and make it into the most beautiful and engaging music of all time.
Gotta be rock and roll music if you wanna dance with me. If you wanna dance with me.
Charles Edward Anderson Berry was born on October 18, 1926 in St. Louis, Missouri.
Up in the morning and out to school.
Chuck Berry came from a black middle-class family. His mother had gone to college, which was unusual at the time. His father was a carpenter. It was also completely segregated. He said that the first time he saw a white person was when he was 3, and it was a fireman. And he thought that the man had gone white because he was so scared at the fire.
Chuck Berry went to Sumner High School, which was the school of St. Louis for the middle-class black community, and it's a school that Tina Turner would later attend. And he gave his first performance with his first guitar, an acoustic second-hand Spanish guitar, to the assembled students when he and a school friend played a version of Confessing the Blues.
In 1944, when he was still at high school, Chuck Berry was actually arrested and jailed for armed robbery. Now, the story goes that he and a couple of friends had decided to go on an impromptu road trip, and they'd found a gun, and they'd flagged down a car and used the gun, which they say wasn't, a working gun, to kind of steal the car at gunpoint.
Chuck Berry's argument, apparently, was that their car had broken down and that he wasn't really carjacking anybody. He was just stopping the car, and the pistol that he had was a fake one. Obviously, the authorities didn't fall for this.
Despite being minors and first-time offenders, Chuck was actually sentenced to 10 years in jail, and he was sent to intermediate reformatory for young men in Algoa. But it was here that he started to sing more. He actually formed his own singing group.
This group that he started were actually really quite good. They practiced a lot and they actually played a few gigs. He got out a little bit early as well for good behaviour on his 21st birthday.
Once Chuck got out of prison, he married Themeta Toddy Suggs, who soon gave birth to their first child.
He needed to support his family, so he took on a variety of jobs. He was a janitor in the building. He was a factory worker at a car plant, and then he trained as a beautician.
Chuck Berry did so well at these alternative jobs that he saved enough money to buy a little cottage for him and his family.
But he was also working as a musician. He was performing in clubs in St. Louis. It was here that he was really working out what his style was and getting that experience of performing.
The big influence on Chuck Berry when he was playing the clubs in St. Louis was T-Bone Walker, who's a blues musician.
T-Bone Walker had a very specific way of playing the guitar, where he would bend 2 strings at once to play the note. And this is exactly what Chuck Berry took from him.
Same time, there's a friend of his called Ira Harris, who was a very good guitarist. And so Chuck Berry was already playing guitar, but Ira Harris gave him guitar lessons, and that propelled him onto the next stage. This is really the point at which Chuck Berry invents rock and roll. Chuck Berry was playing with Johnny Johnson's band, and he started bringing in country music, country ballads, initially to black audiences, and he said, well, I was just curious to see what they'd make of it.
Suddenly this guy's on stage, he's bringing in like country and western licks on the guitar and bringing in all these different ideas. When you're the pioneer of a new sound, you're the most popular guy in the room. And everyone probably wanted him in his band because he had that vigour and that imagination.
This mix of different music styles was so successful for the band. It really opened them up to a much wider audience.
So Chuck Berry travelled to Chicago. He was on the hunt for a record deal, and he crossed paths with Muddy Waters, another amazing musician. He said to him, "You've got to go and check out Chess Records. That's where you've got to be."
Chuck went to see Leonard Chess, expecting him to be very interested in his blues music.
Leonard Chess was mainly intrigued by this song called Ida Red that Chuck Berry was doing, which is actually an old country tune. And he said, well, why don't you develop that? And he did, and it became Maybelline.
Maybelline, why can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline, why can't you be true?
Now, you hear this record, you can almost hear rock and roll music being invented in those 2.5 minutes. There's nothing that had ever been quite like it before.
It was the song that really established him. It's incredible to think that his first single was such a huge hit.
Maybelline was one of the most successful recording debuts. I mean, straight in at #1 on the R&B charts. I mean, it's like the dream story if you're a musician. You're straight up at the top.
Roll Over Beethoven is just such an incredible record. It's the blueprint of rock and roll. It's, you know, a call to the past to get out the way because the future's here.
So Roll Over Beethoven, with the follow-up to Maybelline, I mean, it was just so exciting, wasn't it? And so great. And even when you hear it now on the radio, you're like, yes.
Roll over Beethoven, I gotta hear it again today.
Carl Perkins is obviously another man who's got a fair claim to being the inventor of rock and roll. And once he talked to Chuck Berry about country music, they bonded because Carl Perkins knew Chuck Berry knew his stuff. And when Roll Over Beethoven came out, then it mentioned Blue Suede Shoes, Carl Perkins' most famous tune. And also, it was a State of the Nation address. This is the new order. It's going to roll over the old order.
Alan Freed, who's the big DJ at the time and the most important DJ for rock and roll music, organised this tour in 1957 which had the Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry.
In the very combustible United States of that era, these black and white acts sharing the stage was a huge statement. And even in the North, there's only someone with Alan Freed's clout who could actually carry this off.
Deep down in Louisiana, close to New Orleans, way back up in the woods among the evergreens, there stood a log cabin made of earth and wood, where lived a country boy named Johnny B. Good.
By this point, Chuck Berry's releasing songs that have turned into rock and roll classics, absolute greats. Johnny B. Good. I mean, if you just look at Sweet 16 as well, he is telling and storytelling what it was like to grow up in America at that moment. So even when I listen back to it, I think, oh, it just sounds so exciting, and it takes you there. It paints this picture, it's so energetic, but you can sing along with it, and it's great to dance to. It had everything.
They're all about the same thing. They're about being young. He invented the whole genre of songs about cars and girls, and Chuck Berry absolutely nailed that. You know, and he did it in such a simple way.
There wasn't great emotion in these, but the tales that he was telling, the things, gee, the teacher doesn't know how mean she looks, those sort of words were showing that Chuck Berry could actually formulate the views of a generation and the emotions of a generation much younger than he was.
Now you can't get me, baby, you can't catch me. If you get too close, you know I'm gone like a cool breeze.
The rock and roll movies that Chuck Berry appeared in, Go Johnny Go and Rock Rock Rock, are quite interesting because they're not really like movies like you think of them now. They're kind of live performances loosely linked together with a kind of narrative. But what's great is you get to see Chuck Berry perform, and his performance, his stage persona is brilliant. There's the shaky legs, there's the duck walk, something that apparently he'd been doing since he was a child, something that made his family laugh just, you know, around their house. But those classic movements are now so synonymous with his on-stage presence and have, of course, been ripped off by so many people.
That was just another passport for him, really, because it took him into cinemas, movie theatres. Suddenly he was a big, big deal.
They really rock it in Boston,
Jazz on a Summer's Day was a film record at the 1958 Newport Jazz Festival. Thelonious Monk was on it, Anita O'Day was in there, and so was Ray Charles too. But the real star was Chuck Berry singing Sweet Little 16.
Sweet little 16, sweet little 16. She just got to have about $500,000, a famed autograph.
He was really the fish out of water there. And I think that's why, if you speak to a lot of sort of baby boomer age musicians, they say that Jazz on a Summer's Day was the thing that got them interested.
Oh, mommy, mommy, please may I go? It's such a sight to see. Somebody steal the show.
Chuck Berry, who was a very smart businessman, he opened clubs and restaurants with the money that he was making. And when he went back to St. Louis and opened Club Bandstand, then this really was the first racially integrated club in St. Louis. And this was a big thing.
And there's something very important about Chuck Berry, is that he always said he never saw his music in race terms. He never saw it in political terms. He said it was for people.
It knocked down all the boundaries. It wasn't just a club for black musicians or black people wanting to go and just listen to one particular thing. It was for everybody, and his music was universal. It was so important.
Sometimes I will, then again I think I won't.
By the late 50s, Chuck Berry was an international superstar. He'd enjoyed hit records, a lucrative touring career, and even opened his own club.
In 1959, Chuck Berry was on tour in El Paso when he met a 14-year-old girl called Janice Escalante, who was possibly working as a prostitute at the time. And Chuck Berry immediately offered her a job as a hat check girl at his club and a job on the rest of the tour as a merchandise seller.
And his great crime was to take her over state lines. Now, initially he got 5 years.
He then appealed that on racial discrimination. It then got reduced. He appealed it again, lost that appeal, and ended up serving 1.5 years.
Despite spending the early 1960s in prison, Chuck Berry's popularity was actually growing at this time, thanks to a number of bands, particularly the British Invasion, who were either covering him, like the Beatles, or borrowing heavily from his music, like the Rolling Stones.
In 1963, the Beach Boys had their first top 10 American hit, Surfin' USA. Now, this was clearly based on Chuck Berry's Sweet Little 16. And initially, he wasn't credited as a songwriter. And being Chuck Berry, quite rightly, he kicked up a huge stink about it, and eventually he was credited.
Pittsburgh, PA, deep in the heart of Texas, and round the Frisco Bay.
Surfing USA sounds a little bit like Sweet Little 16. It's the same song. I think I'd be annoyed.
Honey, is that you? Oh, Nadine, honey, is that you?
Between 1964 and 1965, Chuck Berry had another purple patch of releasing brilliant singles. There was Nadine, which had echoes of Maybelline about it, another song about a guy chasing a girl, although this time on foot rather than in a car. There was No Particular Place to Go.
Riding along in my automobile, my baby beside me at the wheel. I stole a kiss at the turn of a mile, my curiosity running wild.
It's about the boy trying to seduce the girl. They're in a car and they can't have any physical interaction because they can't get his seatbelt off.
I was anxious to tell her the way I feel.
He's an acute observer of the human condition and of the sexual frustration of teenagers.
It was a teenage wedding and the old folks wished him well. You could see that Pierre did truly love the mademoiselle.
one of the biggest releases for Chuck Berry was You Never Can Tell. And it is so addictive, that song. You can listen to it over and over again. You don't want it to end. And it's got this wonderful fun to it. It's slightly, I don't know why it feels naughty. It feels like you want to be in their gang. And then famously for my generation, it was set in Pulp Fiction. It was the most perfect setting.
TV dinners and ginger ale. But when Pierre found work, the little money coming worked out well. C'est la vie, say the old folks. It goes to show you never can tell.
In 1964, Chuck Berry toured the UK with Carl Perkins. The dates were good, the band were good. He was not necessarily at the peak of his game, but he was pretty close to it.
It said there was a change in Chuck Berry's demeanour between two UK tours, one in 1964 and one in 1965. Carl Perkins in particular talks about this and how when he came back for that second tour, he felt like he had been changed maybe by prison and by also the way that he'd been treated whilst he'd been touring back in America. He seemed harder, he seemed colder, and he seemed a lot more wanting to keep everything in control very much on his own. He didn't want anyone else involved in his business.
In 1966, he moved from Chess to Mercury.
From 66 to 69, he released 5 albums. The big one was the Live at Fillmore Auditorium, which was backed by the Steve Miller Band. And that was huge. And I think it was probably because Chuck Berry was always best live, and for once he had a good band behind him.
And then he had an album called Concerto in B Good, which ended with this 18-minute instrumental version quite similar to Johnny B. Good. And after that, Mercury really lost interest. And it seemed as though Chuck Berry had lost interest in his own career too.
Around this time that apparently Chuck Berry would just turn up to do shows with just a guitar. He would hire in a local band and just assume that they knew all his records. He wouldn't give them a track listing, he would just start playing and they would have to keep up, they'd have to go along with it.
I think this is really the point where he stopped caring in a sense and he became this rather bitter figure who used pickup bands now.
Bruce Springsteen says, he was in one of those bands. He got to play with Chuck Berry on one of those dates, and it was, quite an intimidating experience. And, Chuck didn't talk to the band. He just assumed that they would play along with him. In
the 70s and 80s, Chuck Berry insisted on being paid in cash. And in 1975, he turned up at Sydney Airport with $50,000 in his suitcase. That event meant that the Australian authorities changed some of their laws to restrict the movement of currency.
He eventually was kind of singled out by the IRS for tax evasion, and once investigated, he was convicted and he was sentenced to 4 months in prison and also a number of hours community service as well.
In 1986, Chuck Berry was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Mr. Berry. Dynamite. Dynamite. Thank you.
At the event, Chuck was joined by John Fogerty, Billy Joel, Jerry Lee Lewis, Keith Richards, Neil Young and Steve Winwood to play a few of his hits.
For Chuck Berry's 60th birthday, Keith Richards organised this amazing concert where he had all kinds of guests. He had Etta James, Robert Cray, Linda Ronstadt, and Taylor Hackford filmed the whole thing. So that was a nice moment, and it was kind of crossing over. It was these musicians from younger generations paying homage to Chuck Berry.
Hail, hail, rock and roll, deliver me from the days of old. Long live rock and roll, the beat of the drums loud and bold.
For 18 years, at the Blueberry Hill restaurant in St. Louis, once a month on a Wednesday, Chuck Berry would play a concert.
He cannot possibly have done that for the money. He must have just loved that sense of performing. And maybe he had not necessarily rediscovered his old songwriting ability, but rediscovered his old love for performing. No one was forcing him to do this. It was tease.
gotta be rock roll music if you wanna dance with me. If you wanna dance with me.
In October 2016, Chuck Berry announced he was releasing a new album, which came as a great shock. It had been a long time since his previous one, which came out in the 1970s.
Clearly, he's been writing songs again, because 8 out of 10 of the songs on the record are Chuck Berry originals. And there's guests, such as the brilliant bluesman Gary Clark Jr., Tom Morello out of Rage Against the Machine. And in addition to the well-known musicians who are on this record, then there's also 2 of his children and 1 of his grandchildren too. So it's a real family affair.
I didn't cry.
On the 18th of March 2017, Chuck Berry died.
He was preparing for the release of the Chuck album, and he died of cardiac arrest. As one of his sons said, he's a man in his 90th year.
It was a really sad day, I think. People paid tribute from all walks of life, from politicians to musicians to fans. You know, it was a day where everyone remembered, you know, how important his role was in rock and roll.
Ring, ring goes the bell. The cook in the lunchroom ready to sell.
Bob Dylan called him the Shakespeare of rock and roll, and I think that's quite a nice description, really, because he really did write down and sing and express what it was like to be a teenager and growing up in America.
But the teacher don't know how mean she looks.
He coined the sort of central concerns of rock and roll better than anyone, and he did it with a certain purity.
John Lennon said, if you could give rock and roll another name, you might as well call it Chuck Berry. And Chuck Berry's legacy is rock and roll.
Hail, hail, rock and roll. Deliver me from the days of old. Long live rock and roll. The beat of the drums loud and bold.